She bought a man, his children, and his broken land, not with coin, but with a silence that held the weight of a scream. Montana Territory. The Grable River Valley. Autumn, 1887. The wind was a wounded beast, keening through the skeletal cottonwoods and whipping dust from the hard-pound street of redemption. It was a town that had forgotten its own name, a place where hope came to die. And at its heart, a man was being sold. Not in chains, not with the crack of a whip, but with the dry, merciless rap of an auctioneer's gavel. Ethan Cole stood on the steps of the land office, a ghost haunting his own ruin. One leg was bound in a crude iron brace, a permanent reminder of the blizzard that had taken his wife and his future. His 3 daughters were small, frightened anchors in the storm of his disgrace. Clara, the eldest at 10, stared with the defiant fury of a cornered wolf. 7-year-old Martha clung to his good leg, her face buried in his worn denim. And little Lily, only 5, held his hand with a grip that belied her size, her wide eyes fixed on the jeering faces in the small crowd. The ranch, Blackwater Creek, was drowning in debt. The bank, personified by a portly man in a sweat-stained bowler hat, wanted its pound of flesh. "Do I have a bid for this prime parcel?" the auctioneer called out, his voice slick with false enthusiasm. 300 acres, a sturdy house, a barn that needs some love, and all its current fixtures. He winked, a greasy, cruel gesture toward Ethan and the girls. A few men snickered. Ethan's jaw was a ridge of granite. He felt the shame coiling in his gut, a cold snake. He had failed them. He had failed the memory of his Sarah. He had fought the land, the winter, the grief, and he had lost. The crowd was silent. No one would take on his debt, his bad luck, his broken body. The banker smiled, ready to claim it all for pennies on the dollar. The gavel raised. A final, public death. Then, a movement. A ripple through the dust and apathy. A woman stepped out from the deep shadow of the livery stable. She was a spectre, wrapped in a plain, travel-stained dress the color of scorched earth. Her face was obscured by the brim of a man's battered hat and a curtain of dark, unkempt hair. She carried no purse, no reticule. In her hands, she clutched a rough burlap sack, held tight against her chest like a shield. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace that drew every eye, silencing the whispers. She stopped before the auctioneer's block, a pillar of stillness in the swirling wind. She did not speak. She simply knelt, placed the sack on the dusty ground, and untied the twine that held it shut. She tipped it over. It was not coin that spilled out. It was a fortune. Heavy gold nuggets, glinting with raw, primal light. Tightly bound stacks of banknotes. And at the very top, a sheaf of official-looking deeds to properties in prosperous eastern cities, their seals unbroken. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was more than enough. Far more. The banker's jaw dropped, his smugness evaporating into disbelief. The auctioneer stared, speechless. The woman looked up, her gaze bypassing them all. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, found Ethan's. For a long, breathless moment, they held his. There was no pity in them. No triumph. There was a shared, desolate understanding. A recognition of ruin. Then, she looked at the girls, and a flicker of something unreadable softened the harsh lines of her face. With a slender, calloused finger, she pushed the pile of wealth forward. An offering. A purchase. The banker, recovering himself, scrambled to count the money, his hands trembling with greed. The deed to Blackwater Creek was hastily signed over. When the clerk asked for her name, she simply picked up the pen, dipped it in the inkwell, and drew a single, elegant letter on the signature line. That was all. The transaction was complete. The crowd began to murmur, a hive of questions that received no answers. The woman rose, retrieved her now empty sack, and stood waiting. She owned it all. The land. The house. The debt. And in the unforgiving calculus of the frontier, she owned him. Ethan felt the ground shift beneath him. He was no longer a man, but a fixture. A part of the property. He gathered his children, his pride a raw, open wound, and began the long walk home. And behind him, at a respectful distance, his silent, mysterious new owner followed, her shadow stretching long in the dying light. The first weeks were a silent war of attrition. Ilara, as they would eventually learn was her name, was a phantom in their home. She claimed the small, drafty lean-to off the kitchen, a space previously used for storing firewood and broken tools. She asked for nothing. She took nothing that was not freely left for her. Each morning, before the sun had even thought of cresting the Sawtooth Mountains, Ethan would wake to the soft sounds of her movements. He would limp to the kitchen to find the fire already blazing in the hearth, a pot of coffee brewing, its aroma a small, startling comfort in the cold gloom. He never saw her make it. By the time he was up, she was already outside, a tireless rapture of motion against the vast, empty landscape. She worked with a ferocity that shamed his own broken body. She mended the fences he could no longer climb, her small frame surprisingly strong as she hauled new posts and strung barbed wire. She rethatched the leaking roof of the barn, moving across the high beams with a fearless, fluid grace. She cleared the creek bed of the debris that had choked it since the great thaw, her hands, raw and bleeding, never ceasing their labor. Her presence was a constant, unnerving weight. She never spoke. Not a word. Not a whisper. When he tried to thank her, leaving a plate of food by her door, she would eat it, and the plate would reappear, washed clean, on the kitchen table before dawn. It was a language of gestures, of actions, a conversation held in the space between things. The girls reacted each in their own way. Lily, the youngest, was fascinated. She would watch the silent woman from behind doorways, her thumb in her mouth. One afternoon, she left a small, wilting prairie rose on the cot in the lean-to. The next morning, Lily found a small, intricately carved wooden bird sitting on her own windowsill. It was a perfect, tiny wren, its head cocked as if in mid-song. A silent thank you. Martha remained deeply suspicious, her loyalty to her mother's memory a fierce, protective wall. She saw Ilara's tireless work not as help, but as an invasion, an attempt to erase what had come before. Clara, the eldest, was openly hostile. She's a witch, she hissed at Ethan one evening, as they watched Ilara from the porch, a lone figure mucking out the stalls. Why doesn't she talk? What does she want from us? Ethan had no answer. He only watched. He saw the bone-deep weariness she tried to hide as she slumped onto her cot at night. He saw the way she would sometimes freeze at a sudden sound, her hand flying to her throat, a stark, animal terror in her eyes. He saw the scars that littered her arms, long, pale lines against her sun-darkened skin, which she always kept covered with long sleeves, even in the midday heat. He saw not a witch, but a haunted soul. One evening, a piece of the porch railing, rotten and neglected, gave way as Ethan leaned against it. His bad leg buckled, the iron brace twisting cruelly. He cried out, stumbling, about to fall to the hard ground below. In a blur of motion, Ilara was there. She had been sitting in the shadows, mending a harness, and she moved with the speed of a striking snake. She threw her body against his, her shoulder digging into his ribs, her surprising strength holding him up. For a moment, they were tangled together, a mess of desperation and surprise. His hand grasped her arm to steady himself, and his fingers brushed against the rough fabric of her sleeve. She flinched as if burned, a sharp intake of breath the only sound she made. He immediately let go. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as his owner, not as a mystery, but as a person. Her face, inches from his, was pale beneath its layer of dust and sun, her stormy eyes wide with a fear that had nothing to do with his fall. "I'm all right," he said, his voice rough. "Thank you," she gave a short, sharp nod, pulling away as soon as he was stable. She retreated back into her shadows and her silence. But something had changed. A barrier, invisible but solid, had been breached. That night, for the first time, he didn't just leave coffee for her. He left 2 cups by the fire, and he sat in the pre-dawn quiet, waiting. She did not join him, but when he went outside later, he saw that the second cup was empty. It was a beginning. The first snows came early, blanketing the valley in a sudden, suffocating silence. The world shrank to the four walls of the small ranch house. The enforced proximity was a crucible, burning away pretense and forcing a raw, new intimacy. The wind howled a ceaseless dirge, rattling the window panes and piling drifts against the doors. They were trapped, for souls and a ghost, in a wooden box adrift in a sea of white. The silence that had defined Ilara's presence began to feel different inside the house. Outside, it had been a part of the vast, empty landscape. Inside, it was a living thing, taking up space, heavy with unspoken histories. One afternoon, a tense boredom settled over the children. Martha, in an attempt to replicate a recipe of her mother's, tried to bake bread. Distracted, she pulled the searing hot pan from the oven with a thin rag, crying out as it burned through to her palm. The smell of scorched cloth and skin filled the small kitchen. Ethan rushed to her side, but it was Ilara who acted. She moved from her corner by the fire, her usual stillness replaced by an urgent, focused calm. She gently took Martha's hand, her touch surprisingly soft. She murmured something, too low to be a word, more a sound of soothing, of comfort. Martha, still crying in pain and shock, didn't pull away. Ilara led her to the water basin, running cool water over the angry red welt. Then, from a small leather pouch she always carried at her belt, she produced a dark, fragrant salve. With infinite care, she spread the ointment over the burn. The scent of comfrey and yarrow filled the air. She wrapped the small hand in a clean strip of linen. Throughout the entire process, she never took her eyes off Martha's face, her own expression a mask of profound empathy. When it was done, Martha looked down at her bandaged hand, then up at the silent woman. The suspicion in the child's eyes had dissolved, replaced by a dawning, tear-filled gratitude. It doesn't hurt so much now," she whispered. Ilara simply nodded, her hand lingering for a moment on Martha's shoulder before she retreated back to her corner. The act of pure, unhesitating kindness had done more than weeks of labor ever could. It had pierced the armor of a child's grief. Later that night, the storm raged its worst. The fire cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. The children were asleep, huddled together for warmth. Ethan sat staring into the flames, oiling a piece of leather, the rhythmic motion a balm to his frayed nerves. Ilara sat across from him, sharpening a knife with a whetstone, the sheeing of steel on stone a counterpoint to the howling wind. In the flickering light, a log shifted in the fireplace, sending a shower of sparks onto the hearth. As she leaned forward to push it back, her sleeve slid up her arm, revealing what the fabric usually concealed. It was not the pale, thin lines he had glimpsed before. This was different. A jagged, ugly scar, puckered and twisted, high on her forearm. It was a brand. An intricate, cruel design he couldn't quite make out. She saw him looking and quickly pulled the sleeve down, but it was too late. The secret was out. An aching silence stretched between them, thicker than ever before. Ethan stopped his work. He looked from her hidden arm to the iron brace on his own leg. A mark of violence. A mark of survival. He broke the silence first, his voice low and raspy. "A bear," he said, tapping the brace. "Last spring. Lost a calf. Almost lost the leg." He offered his own wound, his own story of pain, as a bridge across the chasm of her silence. She looked at him, her eyes glistening in the firelight. Her throat worked, as if trying to form words that had long been rusted shut. She took a shuddering breath. When she finally spoke, her voice was a ghost, a dry, dusty whisper, the sound of a voice unused for an eternity. "A man," she said. Just 2 words. But they held a universe of pain. The dam of her silence, once breached, began to crumble. In broken, halting sentences, the story emerged. Her name was Ilara. She was from a green, gentle place back east. Her father had been a merchant, prosperous and kind. She had been promised to a man named Silas Blackwood, a man of immense wealth and influence, a man who saw the world and everyone in it as his possession. She had refused him. Her refusal was not something Silas could comprehend or tolerate. It was an insult to his power. His revenge was not swift and clean, but slow, meticulous, and cruel. He destroyed her father's business, spread vicious lies that turned their community against them, and bled their family dry until they had nothing. But it wasn't enough. He wanted to own her spirit. He had her cornered one night, and when she fought him, he and his men held her down. He told her that if he could not have her, he would mark her, so no other man would ever want her. He had heated the end of a decorative iron poker from the fireplace, one bearing his own family crest, and branded her like cattle. Her father, trying to intervene, had been beaten nearly to death. He died weeks later. Ilara, with her mother's help, escaped with the family's hidden emergency savings, the gold and deeds she had used to buy the ranch. She had been running ever since, living in silence, hiding her shame, vowing to find a place so remote, so broken, that no one would ever look for her there. A place like this. When she finished, she was trembling, silent tears tracing clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. Ethan did not move. He simply listened, his heart aching with a pain that mirrored her own. He saw her now, not as a mystery, but as a survivor. A warrior. Two scarred people, trapped in a storm, finding a fragile sanctuary in the shared geography of their wounds. The wind outside seemed to howl a little less fiercely. The arrival of the carriage was an obscenity against the clean, white landscape. It was a polished black lacquer box, pulled by four perfectly matched grey horses, their hooves churning the fresh snow into solid slush. It rolled to a stop before the humble ranch house, looking as out of place as a diamond in a dustbin. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was impeccably dressed in a fine wool coat with a beaver fur collar, his boots polished to a mirror shine despite the mud. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp-edged way, his smile a thin, bloodless slash in his pale face. It was Silas Blackwood. He surveyed the modest house, the weathered barn, the man with the iron brace on his leg standing on the porch, with an expression of supreme, undisguised contempt. He had found her. His gaze swept past Ethan as if he were a piece of furniture and settled on the doorway, where Ilara had frozen, her face ashen, the color draining from her lips. The old terror was back, stark and paralyzing. The children, sensing the shift in the air, scrambled to hide behind Ethan's legs. "There you are, my dear," Silas said, his voice a silken weapon. "Did you really think you could hide from me in this sty? I must admit, I admire your resourcefulness." Stealing from me and running to the ends of the earth, he took a step forward, a predator closing in. "But the game is over. You are coming home." Ethan shifted his weight, his knuckles white on the head of his sturdy hickory cane. He moved to place himself more squarely between Silas and Ilara. "This is her home," Ethan said, his voice low and steady as a rock. Silas finally deigned to look at him, a flicker of amusement in his cold eyes. "And who are you? The hired help? I bought this woman, body and soul, long before she squandered my money on this patch of dirt. She is my property. Now, stand aside, cripple, before you get hurt." He gestured, and two large, thuggish men emerged from behind the carriage. Ilara felt the old, familiar ice creep into her veins. She felt the urge to run, to hide, to disappear back into the silence that had been her only shield. She looked at Ethan, standing defiant on his broken leg. She looked at the faces of the children peering out from behind him, Lily's terror, Martha's newfound trust, Clara's angry defiance on her behalf. Something inside her shifted. This was not the past. This was not the dark room with the fireplace. This was her land. This was her home. The fear did not vanish, but a new feeling rose to meet it, hot and fierce as a forge. It was rage. And it was love. She stepped out from the shadows of the doorway and walked to stand beside Ethan. She was no longer a ghost. She was a woman of flesh and blood and fire. Silas's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He had expected tears, pleading, collapse. He had not expected this. "I am not your property, Silas," she said. Her voice did not tremble. It was clear and sharp as newly broken ice. "I am not your anything. You destroyed my family. You tortured me. You left me with nothing. But you were wrong. You left me with myself. And I used that to build this." She swept a hand out, encompassing the house, the land, the man beside her, the children behind him. "This is my life. And you are not welcome in it." Silas's face contorted into a mask of pure fury. "Insolent wretch! I marked you. I own you," he snarled, lunging for her. His men moved forward. But as they did, the barn door slid open. The two ranch hands Elara had quietly hired weeks before, men Ethan had been forced to let go, stood there, armed with pitchforks. From around the side of the house came the sheriff, flanked by two armed deputies. He'd been in town when the fancy carriage arrived, and a frantic Lily, slipping out the back, had run the whole way to get him, her small legs pumping through the snow. Silas stopped, realizing he was no longer the one with the advantage. He tried to grab Elara's arm, the one with the scar. But she did not flinch or pull away. Instead, Ethan moved with a speed that defied his injury. He swung his heavy cane in a low arc, sweeping Silas's feet out from under him. The arrogant man went down with a surprised grunt, landing hard in the muddy snow. The fight was over before it began. His thugs, seeing the deputies' rifles, raised their hands. Silas, humiliated and covered in filth, was hauled to his feet. His mask of civility was gone, revealing the ugly, impotent rage beneath. "This isn't over," he shrieked at Elara. "I will ruin you. I will burn this place to the ground." The sheriff shoved him toward the carriage. "Your business in this territory is concluded, Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice flat. Silas was driven away, his threat swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence of the valley. Elara stood watching until the carriage was a small black speck in the distance. She was breathing heavily, not from fear, but from the sheer, exhilarating force of her own survival. She had not been rescued. She had stood her ground. And she had won. The sun began its slow descent, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of rose and gold. The violent intrusion was over, leaving behind a profound and cleansing quiet. The air was crisp and cold, smelling of pine and wood smoke and peace. Elara stood on the porch, wrapping her arms around herself, not for warmth, but as if to hold herself together after the storm. The ranch hands had returned to the barn. The sheriff had tipped his hat and gone. It was just them again. The family. The three girls came out of the house. Lily ran to Elara and buried her face in her skirts, her small body trembling with the aftermath of her bravery. Martha stood close, her hand gently taking Elara's. And then Clara, the guarded, hostile Clara, stepped forward. She looked at Elara, her young face a mixture of awe and contrition. "He said he marked you," Clara whispered, her eyes full of a dawning, terrible understanding. "He hurt you." Elara knelt, so she was at eye level with the girl. She gently pushed up her own sleeve, revealing the ugly, twisted scar for all of them to see. She was not hiding it anymore. "Yes," Elara said, her voice soft but firm. "He hurt me. He tried to mark me with his hate. He wanted it to be a mark of shame." Clara reached out a tentative hand and traced the scar with her fingertip. "It's not," the girl said, her voice fierce. "It's a mark of courage." In that moment, the last wall around Elara's heart turned to dust. Ethan came to stand beside her, his presence a solid, comforting warmth. He looked down at this woman who had drifted into his life like a piece of storm wreckage and had somehow become its foundation. She had saved his land, his children, his soul, all while battling demons he could barely imagine. Words felt small and clumsy, inadequate for the truth that swelled in his chest. He reached down and took her hand, his large, calloused one covering hers. "He was wrong," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "You are not owned. You are not marked. You are home." Elara looked up at him, her stormy eyes clear and bright with unshed tears. She looked at the faces of the three girls, who now looked back at her not with fear or suspicion, but with fierce, unconditional love. She looked at the ranch, the mountains, the vast sky. This was her sanctuary, forged in silence and work and pain. This was her redemption. A single tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the day's grime on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of overwhelming, gut-wrenching gratitude. She leaned her head against his sturdy shoulder, a gesture of complete trust, a final surrender to hope. "You," she whispered, her voice no longer a ghost, but alive with a power that filled the twilight air. "All of you. You are the love I prayed for when I had forgotten how to pray." Later that evening, Lily found the old burlap sack, the one Ilara had carried her fortune in, discarded in a corner. She brought it to Ilara. Ilara took the rough, humble sack, the symbol of her flight, her shame, her lonely survival. But now, sitting by the fire, surrounded by her family, she threaded a needle with bright red silk. She did not cast the sack aside. She began to stitch, her needle moving with purpose. Over the mark of a water stain, she embroidered a wildflower. Over a tear, a soaring hawk. She was transforming the fabric of her pain into a testament of her new life, stitch by loving stitch. Years bloomed and faded. The harsh winds of many winters gave way to the gentle green of many springs. The ranch was no longer known by the name of a man who brought it ruin, but as Three Sisters Ranch, a place of sanctuary and strength. Ethan's leg healed, the iron brace replaced by a barely noticeable limp, a quiet reminder of the past he had survived. He was a man remade, his quiet nature now a source of steady calm, not sorrow. Ilara was no longer silent. Her laughter became as much a part of the ranch as the sound of the creek or the lowing of the cattle. It was a rich, warm sound that filled the new, larger house they had built together, its foundation sunk deep into the land she had claimed. The three sisters grew, tall and strong and kind. Clara, with her fierce heart, became a skilled horsewoman who could outride any man in the valley. Martha, with her gentle hands, discovered a gift for healing, her knowledge of herbs and remedies, first taught by Ilara, becoming a blessing to their neighbors. And Lily, with her brave and watchful spirit, possessed a wisdom beyond her years. They were soon joined by a brother, a small boy with Ethan's steady brown eyes and Ilara's quiet, unbreakable will. He was born in the house, in the bed his father and mother shared, a child of love and peace. On the wall of their main room, framed in polished pine, hung a piece of old, rough burlap. It was covered now in a breathtaking embroidery of wildflowers, of soaring birds, of a winding creek and 3 shining stars. A symbol not of what was lost or what was escaped, but of what had been lovingly, painstakingly built. It was a map of their healing. One evening, as twilight settled over the valley, the entire family stood on the porch, watching the last of the alpenglow fade from the peaks. Ilara leaned against Ethan, his arm draped securely around her. Their son slept soundly in his arms. Their daughters stood beside them, no longer children, but young women on the cusp of their own lives. They had created more than a successful ranch. They had created a legacy. A testament to the idea that the deepest wounds can be healed, that the most suffocating silence can be broken by love, and that a home is not a place you find, but a place you have the courage to build, even on the most broken ground.